Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, they say no one is above the law. It's an axiom that's been repeated over and over again by liberal pundits and politicians as they grapple with the anticlimactic indictment that was finally released yesterday following Trump's arraignment. Against all expectations, it seems that Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg isn't in possession of any additional evidence than what federal prosecutors had when they declined to bring a case against Trump for paying hush money to adult film worker Stormy Daniels, nor does he have any more evidence than his predecessor, Cy Vance, when he declined to prosecute the case, leading many people to ask if there's any reason for Bragg to pursue this case other than to carry out a political prosecution, to stop Trump from becoming president again by anti-democratic means. In the face of a shaky legal argument, Democrats have been quick to affirm a principle that sounds good on its face, that no one is above the law. They've argued that typically billionaires like Donald Trump are able to exploit the nuances of the law and their ability to pay for the best lawyers to evade crime. And if anything, the prosecution of Donald Trump, even if carried out on the basis of a tenuous legal theory, is worth it. It's leveling the playing field. And certainly, Trump is guilty of something. In principle, I of course agree that the very wealthy and powerful, including presidents and former presidents of the United States, should not be above the law. But how credibly can we accept Democrats' commitment to that principle when they've embraced so many criminals, seemingly without hesitation? As The Intercept's Jeremy Scahill argued this week, Trump's prosecution is not evidence that our much vaunted justice system can actually be applied fairly and evenly to all, even a former president. What it really shows is it's possible to prosecute a cartoonish villain, even one who served as president, who publicly brags of his misdeeds and criminal activity and happens to be widely despised by the so-called adults in the room. But what about the criminal behavior of those so-called adults? It seems they're off the hook. Scahill points out that it was Obama who set a precedent of affirming that no one would be prosecuted for running a secret global kidnap and torture regime under Bush and Cheney, saying we need to look forward as opposed to looking backward, even though we, quote, tortured some folks. Nancy Pelosi refused to consider impeachment proceedings against George W. Bush, and while we anticipate that there are more serious election interference charges pending against Trump in Georgia, there seems to be no interest in looking at potential liability against Trump for rolling back U.S. limitations on killing civilians abroad. George W. Bush is embraced literally by the Obamas, even though this Freudian slip seems to suggest some self-awareness from Bush about his own war crimes.
The decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, too. Anyway, 75.
That clip never gets old. Independent Senator Bernie Sanders surged in 2016, in part due to his willingness to call out the Iraq War and the failures of the military-industrial complex. Meanwhile, establishment Democrat Hillary Clinton defensively clung to Henry Kissinger as her friend. Kissinger, a war criminal who, among other crimes, approved every bombing raid in Cambodia in 69 and 70, sabotaged peace talks in Vietnam, and backed a military coup in Chile installing despot Pinochet. In America, we'll go after you for fellatio from an intern or payments to a porn star. But war crimes go unpunished. As Scahill argues, international principles like those established at Nuremberg were never intended to apply to Americans. America refuses to subject itself to the International Criminal Court, and it's clear that the only crimes America is worth setting a precedent of prosecuting, at least with respect to former presidents or presidential candidates, are personal ones. 3 years after his 2008 run for president, former North Carolina Senator John Edwards was charged with violating election law after $1 million was paid to his mistress to hide his affair from both the public and his wife, who was dying of cancer at the time. Do these charges feel familiar? Perhaps it's not a coincidence that these are the types of cases our politicized justice departments are willing to set precedent for. Crimes that would implicate only a narrow band of bad actors, unlike war crimes, which would implicate nearly every president to hold office. We wouldn't want too much accountability, would we? To be sure, if Trump did commit a felony in directing payments to Stormy Daniels, the fact that he has done worse crimes or that other presidents haven't been held accountable for their crimes doesn't logically mean that he should escape accountability, of course. But in this case, based on what we know so far from the indictment and AG Bragg's press conference yesterday, it's not even clear that he committed a felony at all. The prosecutor is relying on an untested legal theory that uses a federal campaign violation as a hook to escalate the state falsification of records claims, which are misdemeanors, into felonies. In New York, the falsification of records charge can be elevated to a felony charge if the falsification was done to cover up or commit another crime. The other crime Bragg is pointing to is the federal crime of election interference. But it is not clear that a federal crime can be used as a hook to charge Trump under New York law. Now, the state isn't obliged to plead its entire case in this indictment, and the grand jury was privy to more than what was in the indictment, like text messages between relevant parties and other sorts of color. But even liberal commentators on CNN and NBC struggled to make the case that this was a strong claim. Moreover, given the federal hook, there are likely federal preemption issues, meaning basically that federal courts are supposed to decide federal issues. Trump's lawyers will certainly challenge this jurisdictional issue. Moreover, it just looks pretty bad for the state AG to be pushing a case that federal prosecutors very publicly declined to prosecute, even as they successfully prosecuted Michael Cohen for his role in this very same payoff scheme. Now, the weakness of the case, combined with the seriousness of the crimes presidents, including Trump, have been accused of, makes this a deeply unsatisfying moment in political history. I don't want to root for the kinds of legal manipulations that can just as easily be used to derail a leading political progressive like Lula in Brazil, as self-enriching real estate baron like Trump. A much more satisfying example of accountability would be the U.S. submitting itself to international courts to judge its behavior abroad or at home. It could, for example, support an independent investigation into who sabotaged the Nord Stream pipeline. It could address the criminal behavior of the Wall Street goons that caused Americans to lose upwards of 30% of their collective wealth in the 2008 crisis. Instead, our leaders shielded all but one of those crooks from jail time. Those thieves get jobs in government. Meanwhile, the legacy media gins up outrage about the thieves that stole diapers from Walgreens. More angst about that than the ones that stole your retirement. I do believe that Trump's efforts to overturn election results constitute a crime worth prosecuting. But this prosecution, this doesn't feel like a break from tradition, despite all the talk of how unprecedented it is. This feels like it leads to finding the narrow limits of accountability to make sure that no one ever goes down for the really important stuff, the systemic stuff that undermines our democracy, destroys our communities, and leaves younger generations worse off than the ones before them. Watching Trump get indicted for paying off a woman with whom he had an affair feels like a mere pantomime of accountability. And while some might say the ends justify the means, a la getting Al Capone on tax charges, given the low likelihood that this will even stick, it feels like a waste of public energy and a distraction from what really matters. Biden just kicked 15 million people off Medicaid this week. Who will be accountable for that? So I'm not trying to do whatabouchaism here, but I feel the need to express that this does feel like a kind of gatekeeping, a defining of the realm of kind of political bad acts that the courts, that politicians are willing to go after. We see this when the public rumbles and asks for more accountability with insider trading of politicians, and suddenly everybody circles the wagons and says, "Oh no, this is a bipartisan effort to protect our right to do this thing that enriches us and hurts the American people." And politicians are all invested in us not getting too fast and loose with actually holding them accountable in any meaningful, broad way.
Yeah, when you begin to pull at the string of the military-industrial complex, you run into the issue that so many of our presidents, maybe all of them, virtually all of them, are accountable, should be held accountable for the same transgressions. You brought up George W. Bush. I completely agree. Barack Obama, the intervention in Libya, a humanitarian disaster, ended up punishing, resulting in the death of that country's leader, who, yes, was no angel, but had actually given up nuclear ambitions and was kind of holding the country together and did a lot of unsavory things.
Right.
But ISIS and terrorism and sectarian violence arises in its wake, as we've seen
Slave markets now. Yeah.
time and time again.
Yeah.
That was something, it was done by NATO, actually,
Yeah.
without any vote to declare war on Libya. No American people signing up for nation building there. Done by Barack Obama at the behest of Hillary Clinton.
Yes.
She urged this. So, and you can go back to Bill Clinton, you can go back to Ronald Reagan, you can go all the way down, and you'll find that presidents have abused, especially in matters of foreign policy and war making, their authority to the detriment of people everywhere. But we don't do anything about that.
Exactly.
Rarely do we do anything about that.
So is it a
Congress isn't
coincidence?
interested in doing anything about that.
Is it a coincidence that the things that presidents tend to go down over are not things that would implicate the whole edifice? The
all part of the
whole
plan,
blog, yeah.
as the Joker would say.
All right, let us know what you think. We'll have more Rising right after this.